Prominent developmental theories. Our first lesson is about prominent developmental theories, and all this means is important theories that have to do with human development. So the first one we're going to be talking about is psychoanalytic approach. Psychoanalysis means the development viewed primarily as unconscious and very influenced by emotion. Some important theorists that talk about this approach are Sigmund Freud, and also a neo-Freudian theorist named Carl Jung, and Erik Erikson, and we'll talk all about these theorists in a minute. So the idea is sort of that everything is lurking below the surface, much like the iceberg shown in the picture. So Freud's personality structure theory has to do with three different parts of our personality. There's the id, the ego, and the superego. So the id has to do with kind of like our animal instincts, things that sort of emerge first. It's something that's completely unconscious, and you can kind of think of it as like a first reaction to something, as an animal instinct. And it has nothing to do with morality or sort of humanity. It's more just sort of the most simple of our instincts. Ego is sort of in the middle, and it balances the id and the superego. Our ego has to do with reasoning. It emerges second as demand of reality becomes apparent. And again, there's no morality here. It's just sort of trying to find a balance between the id and our sort of inner instincts and the superego, which has to do with morality. So superego is the last to emerge in the development of a human being. And it has to do with right or wrong, conscience, and sort of feeling like what the right thing to do is in a certain situation. And this superego competes with the id, and it is up to the ego to sort of find a balance between the two. Freudian stages of development. So the first one is the oral stage, and it happens birth to 1.5 years. And if any of you have younger siblings, or if you have just babysat any small babies, this oral stage has to do with sort of like calming themselves by bringing things to their mouths. So sucking their thumb, things like a pacifier, drinking from a bottle, those all have to do with the oral stage. The anal stage is 1.5 to 3 years, and that has to do with just sort of being aware of bodily functions and movements, things like that. The phallic stage is 3 to 6 years, and this is where the appearance of the Oedipus complex or the Electra complex, as proposed by Carl Jung, sort of emerges. The latency stage is from 6 years to puberty, and then the genital stage is from puberty onwards. Stages are based on where pleasure is focused. So, of course, with our first example, we can see that babies derive their pleasure mostly from their mouth. Personality is determined by how conflict is resolved during each of these stages. Fixation. So the idea of fixation is when an individual gets stuck at a certain stage of development, and it occurs when conflict is resolved ineffectively. Needs are either over or undergratified. So if we use our first example of the oral stage, Freud might say something like, if someone becomes fixated or stuck at the oral stage between birth and 1.5 years because either their needs were overmet or undermet, he might say that this is the reason why somebody might take up smoking. This might be the reason why somebody bites their fingernails. So anything having to do with the mouth that is maybe not the best habit, Freud would believe that that person would be stuck in the oral stage or fixated in the oral stage. Erik Erikson. So this person is very much related to Freud, and he sort of built on some of the ideas that Freud came up with. So he recognized Freud's contribution to study of development, psychosocial development over psychosexual development as Freud had proposed, and basic personality shaped within the first 5 years. There are 8 stages in Erikson's ideas, and each has a conflict and crisis which needs to be resolved. Healthier resolutions lead to healthier development and enhanced potential for the human being. So each of these stages are what Erikson describes as needed in order to sort of pass this sort of stage of development to the next one in this certain period, at a different age of your life. So trust versus mistrust happens in infancy from 0 to 1 year. So Erikson believes that in order to move on to the autonomy stage, we need to develop strong relationships with parents and with other adult figures and develop a strong sense of trust. Autonomy versus shame and doubt. And this is seen sort of 1 to 3 years in kind of a toddler stage. And what that means is the child needs to be able to develop a sense of independence and able to do things themselves in order to move to the next stage. Initiative versus guilt is the next stage, and that happens in early childhood, which means preschool, so sort of 3 to 5 years old. And what this sort of talks about is the child's ability to sort of initiate things for themselves and not feel guilty. Industry versus inferiority is the next stage, and that is in middle to late childhood. So this is where we're thinking sort of like school age, where the child sort of needs to be able to complete tasks and feel as though they are contributing members of a certain society, be that school or a family dynamic, and they need to be able to sort of contribute. Identity versus identity confusion happens a lot in adolescence, according to Erickson. So this is where the child or the young person is learning who they are, and they are deciding, is this identity that my parents created for me, is that who I am? Or, what about this identity that I have at school compared to an identity that I might have with my peers outside of school? And it's just sort of determining who you are as a person before you move on to the next one, which is in early adulthood, sort of 20s and 30s, and that has to do with intimacy and isolation. So what that means is as we are sort of becoming young adults, somewhere in our 20s and early 30s, we're sort of, coupling with another person, learning about what it means to be intimate in both a physical and an emotional state, and learning how it feels to be isolated and possibly rejected by a potential mate. So once that is sort of completed, the next stage is in middle adulthood, and that's in 40s and 50s. And what that means is the person in their 40s and 50s is learning about generativity versus stagnation. So in this stage, when someone is about 40 going into their 50s, this is where sort of like the midlife crisis happens. And what that means is generativity has to do with what's left when you're gone. So it could be a family where you're continuing your family line. It could be a business that you've built. It could be financial, generativity that is being left to children or others, versus stagnation, which means just staying put and doing nothing. So there's sort of like a competition happening between, now what? I have done all of this. I've gotten married. I've had children. I've created this career. What's left afterwards? And how do we move forward without becoming stuck in that sort of stagnation? The last one is in late adulthood, and this is integrity versus despair. And it's just sort of learning to accept that life is a finite thing and eventually it will come to an end. So how do we continue to live and enjoy that without becoming sort of trapped in despair? Erickson's 8 stages, we're going to see that video in a sec. So some final notes on the psychoanalytic approach. So contributions are sort of early experience is very important in development. Family relationships are important through all of these stages. Personality is better understood from developmental perspective, and conscious versus the unconscious mind. So things that we are aware of compared to things that are sort of in our subconscious or unconscious. Development throughout the lifespan happens in all of these different theories, and each one needs to happen. Each step of that development needs to happen in order for someone to be sort of reaching their potential. There's a lot of criticisms about these theories, because it's difficult to sort of scientifically test this theory, it's more anecdotal evidence. There's also a neo-Freudian psychoanalytic theorist, a few actually. So there's Alfred Adler, Karen Horney, Carl Jung, Erich Fromm, and their contributions are basically that there's poor accuracy reconstructing distant pasts. There's sort of too much focus that they're saying from Freud on the sexual underpinnings, and really that's not as much of it. There's also the unconscious mind that is given too much importance in development when we can really sort of be conscious about our choices. The image of humans is too negative, according to them, and culture and gender bias exists in Freud's theory. There's also the cognitive approach. This is an emphasis on conscious thoughts influencing developments. So some important theorists here are Jean Piaget and Lev Vygotsky. Piaget's theory has to do with cognitive development, and this means that children are active participants in their cognitive development, meaning that they can make choices as well. Organization. Organize experiences to make sense of the world. So basically, if we use this picture as an example, if we have 3 negative experiences with a white rabbit, we might determine that we might organize those experiences and decide that possibly white rabbits are dangerous. So it's all about organizing experiences to determine how we can make sense of the world. Assimilation is an important part of this theory, and that means incorporating new information into existing knowledge. So if we use our same example, if we have 3 negative experiences with a white rabbit, but then a white rabbit becomes our best friend, we need to sort of change how we're thinking about it. Adaptation is another part, and that means just thinking about including new ideas and then accommodating, which means adjusting to that new information as things change. Piaget's 4 stages of cognitive development are sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. So sensory motor just begins where children are 0 to 2 years of age and they begin to interact with their environment. So when a child is born, they can barely see even a few inches or a few centimeters away from their face, only just enough to see their mother. And as they develop, they begin to interact with their environment. They can see further away, they're able to grasp things, they're able to stand or crawl and move around their space. So this has to do with the sensory motor stage. The pre-operational stage happens sort of 2 to 7 years old, and a child begins to represent the world symbolically. So this means pretend play, using toys to represent people. Drawing also happens at this stage, where children are being able to represent their feelings, their experiences, symbolically by drawing or creating. And then, of course, the next one is the concrete operational stage, and that's school age, so sort of 7 to 12 years old, where a child starts to learn the rules and sort of what they need to do in order to be a happy and contributing member of society, whether that society is school, home, a job in the future. They sort of learn what it means to be successful in society. So that has to do with possibly conservation and just sort of the social rules that we learn going through. Next is the formal operational stage, and that is adolescence, so sort of 12 to adulthood, where the adolescent begins thinking about abstract thought, things that are sort of beyond a concrete situation. Vygotsky's sociocultural cognitive theory, like Piaget, he believed that children actively construct knowledge. Development is inseparable from social and cultural activities. Knowledge is situated and it's collaborative, meaning that it is created by working together, and knowledge is also constructed through interactions with other people and other objects. Processing theory. Brain is seen more as a computer-like thing. It is manipulative, you can monitor and you can strategize about information. We learn by actively processing the information we gather from our sensory systems. Memory and thinking are central to this theory, and our leading expert is Robert Seigler, which is 1949 to present. So some final notes. The cognitive approach, contributions meaning new view, emphasizing conscious thinking. Piaget and Vygotsky emphasize examining developmental changes in thinking. And some of the criticisms are that there's not a lot of consideration for the individual. Like, we don't all follow the exact same path. So there's sort of a limited description of the changes that occur between each of the different stages. The ethological approach has to do with the study of animals, evolution, behavior, physiology, and communication. So behavior has strong ties to biology and evolution, and we can see that some important theorists here would be Charles Darwin, of course, with his theory of evolution, Konrad Lorenz, and John Bowlby. So Darwin was in the time period 1809 to 1882, and he sort of started talking about connections between humans and animals. He started understanding nonverbal, social, and other innate behaviors that occur in animals, and he compared these behaviors from animals to humans. So many related species, one of them, of course, being primates. So comparing the responses of children to the exceptionalities to children without exceptionalities. For example, if someone had deafness or blindness or was neuroatypical, we can compare these behaviors across different cultures as well. Konrad Lorenz was a German zoologist, and he studied the innate behavior of animals. Imprinting of birds and how they sort of immediately follow the first creature that they see, whether it's their mother or not. And there was a study of mother-child attachment. And there's, of course, critical periods of attachment. So in the birds, it was, the second that they escaped the shell, they would imprint on whatever creature they saw. And with human beings, of course, it's similar. The first person that is caring for the child is one that they imprint on deeply. John Bowlby talked about attachment theory, and this is one that is still being talked about in many parenting circles. And in this theory, we have infants who are creating these enduring bonds with caregivers beyond just physical nourishment. Like they're creating bonds not just because they are getting milk or they're getting food from a caregiver, not just because there's a roof over their head, not just because they're being put to sleep. It sort of goes beyond that and has to do with emotional attachment. So a caregiver's role is to protect infants for survival of the species. Behaviors of infants are to elicit a response: crying, cooing, smiling. Babies and infants do this in order to get something. Babies cry if they need to eat. They coo if they're seeing something that they like and they want to see it again. They smile at a caregiver because they're developing that attachment and they want that to continue. Infants, their senses are tied directly to that caregiver, and frequent check-ins with a primary caregiver ensure availability and attentiveness. Some final notes on this one. Focus on biology and evolution. Contributions are naturalistic observation, emphasis on sensitive periods of development, and some of the criticisms are that these sensitive periods are viewed as too rigid. Just because something happens in what's considered a sensitive period does not necessarily mean that a child will not develop properly. There's also not enough focus on cognition or thinking. There's too much focus on biology. And some great research for animals, but not necessarily for humans. And then we have our behavioral and our social cognitive approach. Behaviorism, scientifically studying only what can be measured and observed, and some of these theorists are Pavlov, who you may have heard of, John Watson, B.F. Skinner, Albert Bandura, and Walter Mischel. So before we have unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response. And then during this, we have unconditioned stimulus and neutral stimulus, unconditioned response. And after, we have conditioned stimulus, conditioned response. So this is a diagram that sort of shows what Pavlov's model means. So you may have heard of this study that happened where Pavlov would ring a bell and then he would feed the dog. So eventually the dog learns that when Pavlov rings a bell, food is coming. So he starts to salivate. So he starts to associate, the dog starts to associate the sound of a ringing bell with food coming, because every time Pavlov served his dinner, he would ring a bell. Next, we have John Watson, and this shows that Pavlov's classical conditioning could be used on humans. A loud noise is an unconditioned stimulus. It creates crying and fear, and of course we have he used the example of a white rat conditioned stimulus, where he would put a rat through a maze and he would zap the rat if it touched a certain thing and then feed the rat if it touched another. So this operant conditioning has to do with punishment and reinforcement. So a negative thing will happen with one stimulus. So like his example, where if the rat touches one thing, it will be zapped, and that's negative. And then we have the positive reinforcement, where if they touch the correct spot, they get fed. Next, we have Albert Bandura, and this is the social cognitive theory. Reciprocal relationships between environment, personal, and cognitive factors and behavior, belief that these factors are the most prominent in development, and Bandura's early research suggested that observational learning, which is basically imitation and modeling, takes on the characteristics of another behavior rather than directly repeating it. So some ideas about behavioral and social cognitive approaches. Contributions are things like the importance of scientific research, the hard science, roles of environment in determining behavior, basically what is around us really changes our behavior, and the importance of learning through observation. Criticisms are that there's too little emphasis again on cognition and developmental changes, and too much on the environment, and it's too mechanical in nature. Finally, we have the humanist approach. Humanism, people working to become the best that they possibly could become. And this was spoken about by Carl Rogers and also Abraham Maslow with his self-actualization theory. So Carl Rogers was early 1902 to 1987. And he believed that all living creatures strive for the best version of themselves. Plant growth goes towards light, and dogs are aiming to please. Congruence, meaning self-defined relationship between a person's ideal self and real self, and incongruity, difference between ideal self and real self. Abraham Maslow, this is 1908 to 1970, so really similar in time period. And the hierarchy of needs explains human motivation. So why do we do what we do? And Maslow created a pyramid that had 5 tiers. And the first 4 are having our needs met. So motivation to fulfill these needs when they are unfulfilled. And the 5th one can't be met until the first 4 are sort of checked off our list. So this is the pyramid. And what Maslow believed is that in order to be able to actualize your potential, the purple one at the top, we need to be able to get our basic needs and our psychological needs met first. So what that means is if we don't have food, if we don't have water or warmth, how can we achieve our potential? If we don't have security and safety, how can we even think about prestige or feeling accomplished? We have to check off the bottom parts of the pyramid in order to move forward and actualize our full potential. Some final notes on the humanist approach. So there's positive view of humans. It's influenced by therapist and client relationships, and there's consideration for the environment. Some criticisms are that it's very subjective and it lacks scientific rigor. We also have Bronfenbrenner's ecological approach. So this one has to do with environmental system development, and it was by Yuri Bronfenbrenner, which is 1917 to 2005. So this shows his chart with the child in the middle and all of the different systems that are in place to sort of help the child recognize their potential. So we have microsystems and macrosystems. So we have things like extended family and neighbors, and then the microsystems are things that are directly around the child that they experience every day. So things like family, school, peers, maybe a daycare facility or a neighborhood playground. And sort of as these circles go out, they have less impact on the child. So some final notes on this. Contributions. So systematic view of environmental impact on development. It has connections between the different environments, and there's consideration for socio-historical influences. Some criticisms are that there's too little focus on the biological influences and cognitive processes, meaning sort of like DNA and our own personal personality that we're born with, and our thought processes. So these are just sort of, these slides you can go over on your own, and it's just sort of talking about the different keywords and ideas. And of course, they're in the content section for you to look over again and just sort of familiarize yourself with, and you can save these as well. So I'll just quickly scroll through. So our next, ignore those dates, obviously they're old, they're from semester 1, but we have our developmental theories chart that is coming up, and it's going to be due.